Hey, welcome back everybody. We are reading Copper Sun, Sharon Draper, and we are now on chapter 30, the last chapter from Polly's perspective in part 6, and it is called Tidbit's Farewell. Polly shook herself awake as she heard voices outside the smokehouse. Sunlight filtered through the slats of the wooden structure. Isabel will recover quickly from the trauma of having a stillborn baby, she heard Mr. Derby say. Already she speaks of us having another child. The doctor's voice sounded unconvinced. Yes, of course. Make sure she gets plenty of rest. Oh, I tend to keep a close eye on her, Mr. Derby replied, his voice laced with barbs. Polly poked Amari, who was still asleep on Teeny's shoulder. Startled, Amari looked around in fear. Teeny, who perhaps had not slept at all, was whispering to Tidbit. You remember all them stories I told you about my mother and the Ashanti and the monkey and the spider stories? She asked the boy, desperation in her voice. Yes, sir, the boy replied, sounding as if he wasn't sure why his mother was telling him all this now. You remember the drums that talk like thunder, and the sun that shone like copper over the valley? You remember what I told you about my mama and how she grabbed a piece of her own mother to take with her? Polly heard Teeny saying. Yes, Mama, I remembers, Tidbit said, whispering dread in his voice. You take this piece of cloth. You hear, boy? Keep it safe, 'cause all my memories be tucked in it. You promise me you will never forget? She asked him plaintively, as she hugged him close to her. Polly watched her tie a leather string around the boy's neck. A tiny leather pouch hung from it. Teeny tucked a colored piece of fabric into the packet and closed it tightly with the drawstring. I remembers it all, Mama, Tidbit said, his voice sounding truly frightened now. You're going to be a man, a free man. I don't want to be no man, Tidbit protested. I just wants to be your little boy. You always going to be my baby boy, Teeny said, though her voice was thick with grief. Always. Polly thought back painfully to the night her mother died, how she had whispered to Polly with her last bit of strength. You make yourself a lady, you hear, my darling? I will always be with you. Polly knew that Teeny's heart felt as if it were being slashed into pieces. You going with us, Mama? The child asked. I'll be going directly, Teeny lied. You stay close to mine and Polly till I get there, you hear? The boy agreed quietly, but he seemed to sense that something was wrong because he started crying. You mind them and do what they says, you hear? Yes, sir, Tidbit replied in a small voice. They all heard the lock removed, and the bright sun shone in like a harsh surprise after the darkness of the smokehouse all night. Mr. Derby stood outside the door and called to them. Come on out of there now. You have a long journey ahead of you, and Teeny, I expect to have my breakfast on the table in half an hour. Yes, sir, she replied sullenly as she emerged from the small room. Teeny squeezed Tidbit's small hand tightly into hers. Amari and Polly came out next, blinking in the bright sunlight. When Amari reached for Polly's hand, Polly took it. The wagon stood hitched and ready. Dr. Hoskins sat on the seat, looking straight ahead, not at the hapless group standing near the wagon. Clay was nowhere to be seen. My son is ill, Mr. Derby said to the doctor, so I'll entrust to you the transaction for the sale of these 3. The doctor nodded silently. Polly and Amari exchanged looks. Evidently, Teeny's seeds had been effective. Would you like me to check on young Clay before I leave? Dr. Hoskins asked half-heartedly. No, I believe he simply drank too much wine. He will sleep it off. Dr. Hoskins looked relieved. I'll make sure your money from the sale of these 3 is safely delivered to you by a courier from Charlestown. He will return with your wagon. It's good riddance to the lot of them, Mr. Derby replied, a look of disgust on his face. To the frightened group in front of him, he yelled, Get in the wagon and be quick about it. Polly climbed in first. Yes, sir, she whispered. It was the same wagon that she and Amari had arrived in. Amari climbed in behind her. Mona, take this child, Mr. Derby commanded. He grabbed Tidbit from Teeny and slung the boy onto the wagon behind Amari. Teeny exploded in grief. Don't take my baby. He's my onlyest child. Oh, Lord, please don't take my baby from me. Tidbit, seeing his mother so upset, began to wail, reaching for her and trying to squirm out of Amari's arms. Hush Puppy barked frantically, adding to the uproar. Mr. Derby, his face red, slashed at the dog with his whip. It ran yelping toward the rice fields. Mr. Derby then stung Teeny with the whip as well. Get to your kitchen and to your duties. You have no more business here. He pushed her in the direction of the kitchen, but she continued to scream and protest, inconsolable. Polly huddled in the wagon, wishing she knew a way to vent the anger that she needed to expel. But she was as helpless as the others. I believe it best if I leave quickly, Dr. Hoskins said over the noise. I agree, Mr. Derby replied. He smacked the horse on the rump. It whinnied. They began to amble on this way. The doctor directed the wagon toward the road. Tidbit shrieked as he realized that he was really being taken away from his mother. Teenie fell to the ground, yelling her grief to the sky. Mr. Derby whipped her again and pulled her to her feet. He half dragged, half walked her back to the kitchen. Hush Puppy continued to bark frantically in the distance. "Mama!" Tidbit screamed hysterically. "Mama!" They turned past the bend in the road, and although she could still hear Teenie's anguished cries, Polly could see her no more. Amari held Tidbit, trying to soothe him, but Polly knew that nothing she could say or do would make the child feel better. So as we end chapter 30, this is kind of just a really quick chapter, but just kind of shows like the heartbreak that would happen when slaves got separated from their families. And this was more of a common occurrence, maybe not under these situations that they're having, but slaves were property. They were like cows, cattle, animals to the slave owners. So there were plenty of times where, you may have a family of 5 and 2 of your kids get separated and sold somewhere else. They may not even be together when they got sold. Your wife could get sold, your wife and your kid, your father. There was no telling. And this is kind of the feelings. They didn't expect for Africans and slaves and African Americans to have the same feelings as other humans. So they just separated them and didn't think twice about it. Or that anguish and that trauma that the Africans felt lasted for years and years and years. So, if you had to have your children frantically, or your mother or father, yanked from you, from your family, love and care, it was a traumatic experience. So now we are leaving Teenie and the Derby plantation and focusing on Amari, Polly, and Tidbit from here on out. So thanks for reading, and I'll see you in the next video.